It all began on one of those days that felt ordinary, yet carried the kind of quiet weight that only reveals itself later. I had been walking down the narrow street in our small town, where everyone seemed to know each other's business, and the silence between neighbors always spoke louder than their words. That's when I saw him again, the carpenter. His hands were calloused, his shirt rolled up just enough to show the veins running across his arms, and his eyes, though soft, carried a heaviness like he had lived through storms no one else had witnessed. I'd noticed him before, of course, fixing doors, repairing fences, always moving through the world with this rugged silence that demanded attention without asking for it. But that day, something was different. That day, his eyes lingered on me a little too long, and mine refused to look away that we were not supposed to cross that invisible line. In our town, being different was dangerous. People whispered, judged, and carried hatred disguised as tradition. I had always lived cautiously, measuring each step, hiding parts of myself just to survive. I told myself that silence was safer, that no one needed to know who I loved or what I felt. But as he walked past me, with that slight nod, something cracked open inside me. It wasn't just attraction, it was recognition. It was as if he saw me in a way no one else dared to. My heart raced, my palms went cold, and I realized I was holding my breath. Later that week, I found myself walking into his small workshop, tucked behind an old bakery where the smell of fresh bread always mixed with the scent of wood shavings. He was there, bent over a half-finished table, his focus so sharp that I almost turned around to leave. But he noticed me before I could. His smile was faint, hesitant, like he was testing the waters, unsure if it was safe to show warmth. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly, carrying both strength and gentleness. I mumbled something about a broken chair at home, though in truth, I had no reason to be there other than to see him again. He nodded, wiped his hands on a rag, and promised to come by the next evening to take a look. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the sound of his voice, the way his eyes had softened when he spoke to me, and how the air between us had felt charged with something unspoken. There was a fear I couldn't shake, too. What if someone saw us? What if the rumors began? What if this attraction was a mistake, just a fleeting moment of weakness? Yet deep inside, I knew it wasn't just a mistake. It was a truth I had buried for too long, and he had unearthed it without even trying. When he came to my house the following evening, the world seemed to shrink until only the two of us existed. He inspected the chair with practiced hands, running his fingers over the wood as if it were something sacred. I watched him closely, not because of the chair, but because every move he made seemed deliberate, carrying a quiet beauty. At one point, our hands brushed, and the silence that followed was louder than any sound I had ever known. He looked at me then, really looked, and I felt naked, exposed, but strangely safe. I could sense his restraint, the way he held himself back, and it mirrored my own. Yet in that moment, there was no denying what had begun to unfold between us. After he left, I sat alone in the dim light of my living room, torn between fear and longing. Part of me wanted to shut it down before it went any further, to protect myself from the judgment of a town that would never accept us. But another part of me, the part that had been silenced for years, was finally awake. It whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was worth the risk. That maybe love, even if forbidden, was still love. And once you taste it, there's no going back. The next few days stretched out like a test of patience I wasn't prepared for. Every morning I woke up with the memory of his eyes, the sound of his voice echoing in my chest, and an ache that refused to quiet down. The chair he had promised to fix still leaned against the wall, untouched, but I knew it wasn't about the chair anymore. It had never been about that. It was about finding reasons to see him, about letting myself drift closer to a truth I had been running from for years. I told myself I could wait, that he would come when he said he would, but the waiting made me restless. The walls of my home felt like a cage, pressing in with secrets I had carried too long. On the fourth evening, just when I thought he had forgotten or changed his mind, I heard a knock at the door. My heart slammed against my ribs as I opened it to find him standing there with his toolbox, his shirt slightly damp from the sweat of a long day's work. His hair was messy, strands falling across his forehead, and his expression carried that same unreadable calm that both comforted and unsettled me. Without a word, he stepped inside, and the small space of my living room seemed to shrink under his presence. He set the chair in the center of the room and got to work, his hands moving with an ease that came from years of practice. I sat nearby, pretending to read, though my eyes never really left him. The sound of the hammer, the scrape of sandpaper, the quiet exhale of his breath, all of it blended into something strangely intimate. It felt like he was leaving a part of himself in the air around us, a piece of his life and labor, and I was breathing it in without permission. At one point, he looked up and caught me staring. I froze, waiting for him to pull back or make a joke, but instead, he held my gaze. There was no judgment in his eyes, no mockery. Just a quiet knowing, as though he understood what I wasn't saying. That single look shook me more than any touch could have. When he finished, he leaned back, wiped his brow, and tested the chair with a firm press of his hand. "It should hold now," he said, his voice low. I thanked him, though the words felt too small for what I wanted to express. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't about the chair, that it was about the way his presence filled a silence I had grown too used to, the way his company made me forget the weight of being alone. But I swallowed the words, too afraid to let them spill into the open. Instead of leaving right away, he lingered. He asked about my day, about the work I did, and though his questions were simple, they carried a depth that made me feel seen. No one had ever asked me things like that without expecting a polished answer, but with him, I felt no need to pretend. I told him more than I should have, about the loneliness, about the way people in this town made it hard to be myself, about the silent walls I had built around my life. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix it, just listened. His silence wasn't heavy, it was steady, like a foundation. The evening grew darker, and when he finally stood to leave, I felt the air shift again, heavy with something unsaid. He walked to the door, but before he opened it, he paused. His hand hovered on the doorknob, his back turned to me, as if he was fighting with himself. Then he turned slightly, enough for me to catch the edge of his profile, and he said softly, "You don't have to hide who you are when you're with me." My chest tightened, and for a moment, the world fell away. I wanted to reach for him, to hold on to that truth he had just offered me, but fear still clung like chains around my wrists. I simply nodded, and he left into the night, leaving me standing in the quiet glow of my living room, trembling from the weight of words I had never expected to hear. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every part of me alive with conflicting emotions. Fear battled with desire, shame wrestled with longing, and yet, beneath it all, there was a small spark of freedom. His words replayed in my mind, each repetition stronger than the last. I didn't have to hide with him. For the first time in my life, someone had given me permission to be myself, and it terrified me as much as it thrilled me. I knew then that something had changed, and no matter how hard I tried, there would be no going back. The days after that evening were filled with a restless energy that I couldn't shake. Every corner of the town felt smaller, tighter, as if its walls had ears. People walked by with their usual smiles, their usual greetings, but I felt their eyes linger on me longer than before, as if they could see something new beneath my skin. I tried to tell myself it was just in my head, that no one knew about the way the carpenter's words had settled inside me, burning like a secret flame. Yet every time I caught sight of him across the street or heard the echo of his hammer from a nearby house, the truth pushed harder against my chest, demanding to be acknowledged. It was no longer possible to pretend I hadn't crossed into dangerous territory, because with just a few words, he had cracked the silence I had spent years building around myself. That I began finding reasons to walk near his workshop, though I told myself it was coincidence. The smell of cut wood drifted into the street, the steady rhythm of his tools calling to me like a heartbeat. Sometimes I would stop at the bakery next door, buying bread I didn't really need, only to catch a glimpse of him through the open door. He was always bent over his work, focused, his body moving with a quiet determination that fascinated me. There was something grounding about him, something unshakable, and it both calmed and unsettled me. I longed to step inside, to be near him again, but fear held me back, whispering that the line between us could never be safely crossed. That it was one evening, after the sun had slipped low and the streets had grown quiet, that I finally found myself outside his workshop without an excuse. The door was half open, light spilling onto the dusty road. I hesitated, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, before finally stepping inside. He looked up from the table he was sanding, and for a moment, surprise flickered across his face, quickly replaced by that steady calm I was beginning to know so well. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, a small smile tugging at his lips. I shook my head, unable to form words, and he gestured toward a stool in the corner. I sat, feeling both exposed and strangely at home. That we didn't talk much at first. He continued working, the scrape of sandpaper filling the silence, while I watched, every detail of him pulling me deeper into something I didn't know how to escape. Eventually, he set the tool down, wiped his hands, and leaned against the workbench. His eyes found mine, and I felt stripped bare again, the way I had in my living room. "You keep looking at me like you're carrying a question you're too scared to ask," he said quietly. My throat tightened. He wasn't wrong. The question wasn't simple. It was tangled with years of shame, of fear, of living in a place where love like mine was treated like a crime. I wanted to ask if he felt the same pull I did, if he carried the same fire inside him that I couldn't put out. But the words refused to leave my mouth. Instead, I whispered something else, something that had haunted me for years. "Aren't you afraid?" My voice was shaky, almost breaking. He took a long breath before answering. "Every damn day," he admitted, his tone steady but honest. "But being afraid isn't the same as being alive. And I'm tired of letting fear decide everything for me." Those words cut through me, sharp and liberating. I had spent so long letting fear dictate my every move that I had forgotten what it meant to live for something real. The silence between us grew heavier, charged, until I couldn't bear it any more. That I stood, my legs unsteady, and stepped closer. He didn't move away. His eyes stayed locked on mine, steady, waiting, giving me the choice. My hand trembled as I reached out, brushing against his arm. The warmth of his skin, the roughness of his work-hardened hands, sent a shiver through me. For a moment, everything else disappeared, the gossiping neighbors, the fear of judgment, the years of silence. All that existed was the two of us, standing in the soft light of his workshop, teetering on the edge of something that could change everything. When he finally touched me back, it wasn't rushed or desperate. His hand rested lightly against mine, as if asking permission without words. I felt my chest tighten, my breath catch, and in that simple touch, I found an answer I had been searching for my entire life. It wasn't just desire, it was recognition, it was truth. And though fear still lingered at the edges of my mind, it was drowned out by the overwhelming certainty that we had already crossed the line, and there was no turning back. That night, I walked home under the weight of a sky full of stars, my heart both terrified and alive in a way it had never been before. Every step echoed with the knowledge that something had shifted, that I was no longer the person I had been just weeks ago. His words, his touch, his steady presence, they had cracked open the silence I once believed was my only safety. Now, the only thing that scared me more than the town's judgment was the thought of losing the fragile, dangerous thing that had just begun between us. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope over a fire I had lit myself. Every glance, every word, every brush of his hand carried a weight that threatened to pull me into a place I wasn't sure I could survive. Yet despite the fear, I kept finding myself drawn back to him. It started with small excuses, passing by the bakery, lingering near his workshop, carrying books I didn't need to read just so I had a reason to sit near his door. Sometimes he looked up, caught me, and offered the smallest of smiles that felt like sparks. Other times, he pretended not to notice, but the way his hands would slow over his work told me he felt the pull too. It was dangerous, intoxicating, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't let it go. One evening, I found myself sitting outside his workshop while the last rays of sunlight painted the sky. He stepped out, wiping his hands on a cloth, his shirt loose around his shoulders, his expression carrying that same quiet strength that always seemed to disarm me. He leaned against the doorway and said nothing at first, just watching me with those steady eyes that made me feel both exposed and safe. The silence stretched between us until it became unbearable, and I finally whispered, "I don't know how to do this." My voice cracked under the weight of the words. He didn't ask what I meant, he didn't need to. He knew that. He moved closer, slow and deliberate, until he was standing in front of me, his shadow falling over my knees. "You don't have to know how," he said gently. "You just have to stop running from it." His words dug into me like nails, because that was all I had done my whole life: run, hide, bury the truth until I could almost convince myself it wasn't there. And yet, standing in front of him, with the air thick and charged between us, I realized how much I didn't want to run anymore. I wanted to stay, even if it destroyed me. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before resting on my shoulder. The weight of it sent a rush through me, grounding me, breaking me, stitching me together all at once. I closed my eyes, letting myself feel the simplicity of his touch, the warmth of his skin, the honesty in the way he didn't try to make it more than it was. Just presence. Just truth. For so long I had lived with emptiness, with shadows, with silence, that the sudden fullness of him felt unbearable. I wanted to cry, to scream, to collapse, but instead, I just breathed. For the first time, breathing felt like enough. The danger, though, was always there. I knew that anyone passing by could see us. The street wasn't hidden, the workshop wasn't tucked away. This was a town where whispers spread faster than wildfire, and I had spent years making sure I never gave them reason to speak my name. And yet, in that moment, with his hand still on my shoulder, I didn't care. I felt something shift inside me, a reckless courage born not from bravery, but from exhaustion, exhaustion of hiding, of shrinking, of pretending. If the world wanted to burn me for this, then let it burn that we didn't kiss that night. We didn't even say much more. But when I left, I carried something new with me, something heavier than fear but sweeter than freedom. It was the knowledge that I was already too far gone to turn back. Whatever line we had crossed, there was no retreat. I walked home with my body buzzing, every step echoing with the sound of my own heartbeat, faster and louder than it had ever been. I looked at the faces of neighbors who greeted me with casual words, wondering if they could see it written all over me, the truth, the longing, the way my life had started to shift beneath my feet. That night, lying in bed, I replayed every second of the evening, every word, every look, every touch. I thought about how simple it had been, and yet how monumental it felt. I thought about his calmness, the steadiness of his voice, the way he had carried his own fear yet still chosen to step closer instead of away. And I thought about myself, the years I had wasted, the life I had lived in silence, the hunger I had buried. Now it was awake, roaring, and I knew it wouldn't be silenced again. My heart ached with the weight of it, but for once, it wasn't the kind of ache that left me hollow. It was an ache that filled me, that told me I was alive. Sleep didn't come easily. I turned over again and again, wrestling with the knowledge of what was happening. The world outside my door hadn't changed. The dangers were still there, the judgment still sharp and ready. But inside me, something irreversible had taken root. I could no longer imagine a life where I didn't feel the warmth of his hand on my shoulder, where I didn't hear the steadiness of his voice in the dark. I was stepping into dangerous territory, yes, but it was also the first time I felt like I was truly stepping into my own life. The next days passed with a strange heaviness in the air, like every moment was waiting to collapse under its own weight. I tried to keep myself busy, tried to go about my routine as though nothing had changed, but it had. Every sound seemed sharper, every glance from the townsfolk felt loaded, and every step I took seemed to bring me closer to a choice I didn't know how to make. I started to notice how quickly rumors spread here, how a single detail in someone's life could be stretched into a story before the day was done. I knew that if anyone saw us together too often, if anyone caught the way my eyes lingered on him, it would be enough to feed the fire. And yet, despite knowing this, I found myself drifting toward him again and again, as if my body had decided it was tired of listening to my fear. One evening, I crossed the street that led to his workshop, pretending I was on my way to the bakery. The lights inside glowed faintly, and I could hear the muffled sound of wood being worked. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, and there he was, sleeves rolled up, sweat clinging to his temples, his hands firm and steady as he shaped something out of raw timber. He looked up at me with that same quiet awareness, the kind that always made me feel like he could see far more than I ever said out loud. "You keep coming back," he said softly, almost like an accusation, but his eyes carried no anger, only a question. My throat tightened as I tried to form an excuse, but the truth pressed harder than the lie. "Because I want to," I admitted, the words trembling out of me. It felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing if the ground would catch me. For a long moment, he didn't move. He just watched me, his chest rising and falling slowly, as though weighing the danger of what I had just confessed. Then, without a word, he set down his tools and wiped his hands. He walked toward me, each step heavy with something unspoken, and when he stopped just a breath away, the air around us seemed to still. His eyes searched mine, looking for hesitation, for regret, for fear, but all he found was the raw, desperate truth I could no longer hide. "You don't know what this will cost," he said finally, his voice low and rough, carrying the weight of warnings he had probably given himself 1,000 times. "I do," I whispered back, though even as the words left me, I wasn't sure if I truly did. All I knew was that the cost of silence had already stolen too much from me. The cost of hiding had carved years of loneliness into my skin, and I couldn't keep paying that price. For once, I wanted something real, even if it burned me alive. He exhaled deeply, and for the first time, I saw the crack in his armor, the vulnerability he had been holding back. His hand rose, slow, hesitant, until his fingers brushed against my jaw. The touch was so gentle it nearly broke me. My eyes closed, and in that moment, the world outside ceased to exist. It was just his hand, his warmth, his presence, grounding me in a truth I had long denied. When I opened my eyes again, he was still there, steady, waiting for me to decide. And then, without thinking, I leaned into him. The kiss, when it came, wasn't fiery or rushed. It was slow, aching, full of years of silence unraveling all at once. His lips were rough, mine unsteady, but together they spoke a language neither of us had dared to utter before. It was tender and raw, laced with fear but stronger than any shame we had carried. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might shatter through my ribs, yet I didn't pull away. For the first time in my life, I wasn't hiding, and it felt like the most dangerous freedom imaginable. When we finally broke apart, the silence returned, but it was different now, no longer heavy, no longer suffocating. It was full, alive, buzzing with something unspoken yet undeniable. He looked at me with an intensity that made my knees weak, and in that gaze, I understood without words that we had crossed into a place we could never return from. There was no undoing what had just happened, no pretending it hadn't, no burying it beneath layers of caution. We had stepped into the fire, and now we would either burn together or find a way to survive it. That I left the workshop that night with trembling hands and lips still tingling from his kiss. The streets were quiet, the town asleep, but I felt more awake than I had ever been. Every shadow seemed sharper, every sound louder, as though the world itself was aware of the secret I now carried inside me. Fear trailed close behind, whispering that the danger was only beginning, but even it couldn't smother the light that had ignited in my chest. I knew then that nothing would ever be the same. The night after our first kiss, the world felt unfamiliar, like I was walking through a life that no longer belonged to me. The streets looked the same, the houses stood unchanged, the bakery still released the sweet smell of bread each morning, yet everything inside me had shifted. My lips still carried the ghost of his, and every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the weight of his hand against my jaw, the warmth that had seeped deep into my bones. I wanted more, and the wanting scared me. I had lived so long in a prison of silence that freedom felt like danger, like stepping into sunlight after years of darkness. I didn't know how to move carefully anymore. Every step felt reckless, but I couldn't help myself. That I found reasons to see him again, reasons that grew thinner with each passing day. A chair that wobbled, a picture frame that needed fixing, excuses so weak that anyone could have seen through them. But he never questioned. He welcomed me with that steady gaze, that quiet strength, and though his words were often few, they carried weight enough to silence the noise in my head. With him, I didn't feel the need to hide behind chatter or masks. He had a way of making silence feel safe, as though simply being near him was enough. And slowly, without either of us saying it out loud, those silences began to stretch into something else, something heavier, something that bound us together in ways no one else would understand, but the town had its eyes. Whispers are born from the smallest of gestures, and though we tried to be careful, I could feel the shift in the way people looked at me. A neighbor's greeting carried hesitation, a shopkeeper's smile seemed forced, and one afternoon I caught two women across the street lowering their voices as soon as I passed by. Maybe it was my paranoia, maybe it was truth, but the fear clawed at me all the same. I started lying to myself, telling myself they didn't know, that I was imagining it, that they couldn't possibly have seen the way my body leaned toward him without meaning to, or the way my eyes softened when his name passed my lips. But deep down, I knew. In a town like ours, nothing stayed hidden for long. One evening, as the sky dimmed and the air smelled of sawdust and bread, I sat in his workshop again, watching him. He was carving something small this time, his hands precise, his focus sharp, and I couldn't take my eyes off him. My chest ached with the simplicity of it, watching him work, being near him, breathing the same air. I wanted to reach across the table, to hold his hand without fear, but the shadows outside the window reminded me that nothing we did was truly private. My frustration slipped out in a whisper I hadn't meant to speak aloud. Why does it feel like the whole world is watching? He paused, his knife stilled against the wood, and for a moment the room was silent except for our breaths. Then he looked at me, his eyes steady, and said, "Because they are. But they've been watching us long before this. The difference is now you have something to lose." His words struck me harder than I expected. I had always known the risks, but hearing them out loud was different. I felt exposed, fragile, like the weight of the town's judgment was already pressing down on me. "Aren't you scared?" I asked. He set the knife down, wiped his hands on the rag, and leaned back against the workbench. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried storms. "Of course I'm scared. But I'm more scared of dying without ever letting myself live. If I have to choose, I'll take the fear that comes with you over the emptiness I had before." His voice broke something inside me, and I couldn't hold back anymore. I reached across the table and grabbed his hand, my grip desperate, my heart pounding. He didn't pull away. He squeezed back, firm and steady, and in that small gesture, I found a courage I hadn't known was in me. That we sat like that for a long time, our hands tangled in the quiet, until the night grew darker and the sounds of the town died down. For a moment, I let myself imagine what it would be like if things were different, if we could walk through the streets together without fear, if I could lean into him without consequence. But the moment faded as quickly as it came, and the heaviness of reality returned. We were building something fragile, something that could shatter with the lightest touch of gossip, and yet, we kept going. Because even fragile things can carry the weight of truth. When I finally left that night, I walked through the streets with my heart torn between dread and longing. Every face I passed seemed to hold suspicion, every sound of laughter felt like it was at my expense. But beneath it all, there was a fire in me that no fear could extinguish anymore. I had tasted something real, something worth the risk, and I knew that even if the world turned against us, I couldn't go back to the silence. I was no longer just surviving. I was beginning to live, and that truth, dangerous as it was, made me feel unstoppable. The night stretched long and heavy after that, and the days that followed seemed to carry a different kind of weight. It was as though the town itself had started whispering louder, as if the walls, the streets, and the very air carried our secret like a rumor waiting to be shouted. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that no one truly knew, that maybe the guilt in my chest was simply making me see suspicion where there was none. But there was no denying how different people looked at me now. Some with narrowed eyes, some with smiles that didn't quite reach their faces, and some with silence that said more than words ever could. Every gesture, every glance, every unfinished sentence left me raw and restless. And yet, even as fear pressed harder against me, I still kept going back to him. That I told myself it was reckless. I told myself it was dangerous. But nothing could keep me away. His workshop had become the only place where I felt like I wasn't drowning. The smell of wood, the hum of his steady work, the way he would stop everything just to give me that small, grounding look, it was enough to remind me I was still alive. One evening, when the light outside was fading and the world had grown quiet, I found myself sitting across from him again. My nerves were frayed from a day of sidelong glances and hushed tones from neighbors, and I felt on the edge of breaking. He noticed it before I said a word. "They're starting to see it, aren't they?" he asked, his voice steady but low. My throat tightened, and I nodded, unable to deny it any more. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, as though the confirmation of his fears was no surprise. "I knew it was coming," he said quietly. "You can't keep something like this hidden forever. Not here. Not with eyes everywhere." I swallowed hard, panic rising in my chest. "Then what do we do?" My words cracked, trembling with the desperation I had been holding in for too long. He looked at me then, his gaze firm, grounding me the way it always did. "We decide if it's worth it," he said simply. His words cut through me, not cruelly, but with a clarity that shook me. Was it worth it? Was this dangerous, fragile, forbidden thing between us worth the judgment, the hate, the exile that would surely come if we were exposed? I thought about the years of silence, the loneliness that had hollowed me out, the emptiness I had carried like a second skin. Then I thought about the way his hand felt in mine, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, the way his presence made me feel whole. And without hesitation, I whispered, "Yes. It's worth it." For the first time, his steady composure cracked. Relief flickered across his face, mixed with something softer, something almost vulnerable. He reached across the table, taking my hand in his, and I felt the tension in my chest ease. "Then we don't run," he said, his voice low but firm. "We stand in it. Together." The words should have scared me, but instead, they settled deep in me like a promise. For so long, I had fought to keep myself hidden, but now, for the first time, I wanted to fight for something else. I wanted to fight for him, for us, for the truth that had been locked inside me for too long. That night, we stayed longer than usual, talking in hushed tones about what might come, about the risk of being seen, about the price of being honest in a place that wanted to bury people like us. He spoke of his own battles, the years of silence he had endured, the ways he had been forced to swallow himself whole just to fit into a mold that was never meant for him. Hearing his story made me ache in ways I didn't expect. I realized then that our bond wasn't just about desire, wasn't just about attraction, it was about survival. It was about two men who had carried too much weight alone, finding in each other a reason to keep going. When I finally left, the streets felt sharper than before, the shadows darker, the silence louder. But instead of shrinking under the weight of it all, I carried myself differently. My chest still pounded with fear, but beneath it was a fire I hadn't felt before. The whispers would come, the judgment would rise, and the town would surely try to tear us apart. But now I knew one thing with certainty, I wasn't facing it alone anymore. And that truth, fragile and dangerous as it was, made me feel stronger than I had ever been. The morning the whispers finally turned into words spoken openly, I felt it before I even stepped outside. There was a shift in the air, a sharpness in the way the town seemed to move, a silence that wasn't silence at all but a tension waiting to snap. As I walked down the street, I caught it in the way people paused mid-conversation when I passed, the way their eyes slid over me and then quickly away, as though looking too long might confirm something they weren't ready to admit out loud. But by the time I reached the market, I heard it, my name, his name, spoken together in tones that dripped with judgment, with disbelief, with the kind of cruelty small towns are so skilled at hiding behind polite smiles. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse under the weight of it. It had begun. The secret wasn't secret anymore. By the afternoon, it was everywhere. A man I had known since childhood refused to meet my eyes when I greeted him. Two women outside the bakery muttered loud enough for me to hear, their words sharp like stones thrown against glass. At first, I wanted to run, to hide, to bury myself in silence again and pretend none of it was true. The shame clawed at me, pulling me back toward the shadows I had lived in for so long. But then, as the noise around me grew louder, I thought of him. I thought of the way his hand felt steady against mine, the way his voice had told me not to run, the way he had promised to stand in it with me. And suddenly, the shame didn't feel as heavy. Suddenly, the whispers didn't drown me. They only reminded me of what was at stake. That evening, I walked to his workshop, the weight of 100 eyes pressing against my back. When I stepped inside, he was there waiting, his expression calm but his jaw tight, as though he too had heard the storm gathering around us. I closed the door, and for a moment, I just stood there, staring at him, unsure if I had the strength to face what was coming. But then he stepped forward, his hands reaching for mine, his eyes steady and unflinching. "It's out," I whispered, my voice breaking under the truth. He nodded, his grip tightening around my fingers. "I know." We didn't speak for a long time after that. The silence between us was thick, but it wasn't empty. It was full of fear, yes, but also of defiance. When he finally spoke, his words were firm, anchored in a strength I envied. "They can talk. They can hate. But they can't take this from us unless we let them." I looked into his eyes, searching for doubt, but found none. For the first time since I was a child, I felt like I belonged, not to the town, not to the whispers, but to something real, something unbreakable. The days that followed were not easy. The judgment came harder now, no longer hidden in glances or hushed tones. Doors closed when we walked by. Invitations stopped coming. There were people who spat cruel words in the open, who made it clear we were no longer welcome in the spaces we once shared. But there were also moments of quiet resilience. A woman at the market handed me bread without hesitation, her eyes soft with unspoken support. An old man tipped his hat as if to say he saw and respected the truth of us. And through it all, we stood side by side, no longer hiding, no longer pretending. The carpenter became my anchor. In the quiet of his workshop, away from the noise of the world, we built a life in fragments, a touch here, a shared meal there, whispered words of comfort in the dark. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't safe, but it was ours. And with every passing day, the fear that once ruled my life grew weaker, replaced by a strength I didn't know I had. I began to realize that survival wasn't just about hiding. Sometimes, survival was about standing in the open and daring the world to break you. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the town in shades of fire, I stood with him outside the workshop, the air heavy with the scent of sawdust and bread. People passed by, their eyes sharp, their words unsaid, but I didn't flinch. I felt his hand brush against mine, subtle, careful, but enough to remind me I wasn't alone. And for the first time, I didn't look away. I let them see. I let the truth stand, raw and unpolished, daring them to strip it from me. That it struck me then, in that fading light, that love is never quiet, even when it hides. It demands to be seen, to be felt, to be lived, no matter the cost. And though the road ahead was uncertain, though the weight of judgment still pressed heavy on our shoulders, I knew with a clarity I had never known before that I would choose him again and again. I would choose this fire, this danger, this truth. Because after years of silence, after years of burying myself to please the world, I had finally found something worth burning for.